The air inside Ethelgard was not merely air. It was a carefully curated atmosphere, a substance thick with the scent of old money and an almost arrogant level of culinary ambition. Light did not simply illuminate the room. It dripped from colossal crystal chandeliers, each one a frozen constellation casting a warm, golden glow upon the patrons below. These were not just diners. They were titans of industry, political brokers and heirs to fortunes built generations ago. Their conversations were murmurs, a low hum of power that vibrated through the plush velvet of the booths and the heavy damask of the tablecloths. The only sharp sounds permitted in this sanctuary were the delicate clinking of silver cutlery against fine porcelain and the soft pop of a cork being drawn from a bottle of wine that cost more than a month's rent. Every surface gleamed with a polish that spoke of relentless, invisible labor. The dark mahogany walls seemed to absorb sound, creating an intimate yet imposing space where deals worth billions were sealed with a handshake and a sip of perfectly aged scotch. This was a world apart, a gilded cage where the harsh realities of the outside world were not welcome, a stage built for the performance of power. Alara Vance moved through this gilded world like a ghost, her presence defined by its own quiet efficiency. Her uniform, a simple, impeccably tailored black dress, was designed to make her blend into the opulent shadows. Her movements were a study in economy and grace, a silent ballet she performed dozens of times a night. She refilled water glasses before they were empty, cleared plates the moment a fork was set down, and anticipated the needs of her tables with an intuition that bordered on precognitive. To the patrons of Ethelgard, she was less a person and more a function, a pair of hands that appeared and disappeared as needed. But beneath this veneer of professional invisibility, a different mind was at work. Her eyes, which seemed to be cast downward in deference, were actually scanning, observing, analyzing. Every subtle shift in posture, every bead of sweat on a brow, every slight tremor in a hand reaching for a glass, was data. She was a scientist, trapped in a waitress's uniform, her brilliant mind, a caged bird, beating its wings against the bars of her circumstance, observing a species in a habitat of its own making. This duality was a heavy cloak she wore every single day. The cool, collected waitress serving seared foie gras was, in her own mind, still the star student of a prestigious MD-PhD program, a prodigy who once lived and breathed the complex language of neurochemistry and rare genetic disorders. That life had been shattered, blown apart with the force of a chemical explosion that had stolen her father's health and her own future. Now, instead of mapping the intricate pathways of the human brain, she mapped the floor plan of Ethelgard. Instead of calculating dosages for experimental treatments, she calculated tips. The primary motivation for this grueling, soul-crushing work was a photograph tucked away in her locker. Her father, a kind-faced chemical engineer, now a shadow of his former self, confined to a specialized care facility. His neurological condition was a rare, cruel beast, a direct result of the toxic spill at his plant, and the cost of his care was a mountain she climbed one meager paycheck at a time. The weight of those bills pressed down on her chest constantly, a physical ache that was a constant companion to the grief that lived in her heart. The chemical spill that had ruined her father had also left its mark on her, though in a profoundly different way. It had triggered a rare form of hyperosmia, an impossibly heightened sense of smell that was both a curse and, as she had learned to control it, a secret weapon. In the beginning, the world had been an overwhelming assault of sense, a chaotic cacophony that left her nauseous and disoriented. But with time, and with the disciplined application of her scientific knowledge, she had trained this anomaly. She learned to filter, to focus, to identify the specific volatile organic compounds that the human body emits. She could dissect a person's scent profile as easily as she once dissected a research paper. She could smell the subtle almond tang of cyanide in a smoker's breath, the faint, fruity acetone of unchecked diabetes, and the musty, earthy odor of liver failure. In the scent-saturated environment of Aethelgard, she navigated a world invisible to everyone else, a world of molecular signatures that told the true stories hidden beneath the expensive suits and polite smiles. The arrival of Marcus Thorne was not an entrance, it was a conquest. The delicate hum of the restaurant seemed to falter for a moment as he swept in, flanked by a younger, obsequious associate. Thorne was a man carved from granite and arrogance, his silver hair swept back from a face that held no warmth, only the sharp angles of command. He wore a custom suit that probably cost more than Ilara's car, but it was his presence that truly commanded the room. He moved with the unshakable certainty of a man who had never been told no, a man who saw the world not as a community of people but as a collection of assets and obstacles. He didn't speak to the maître d', he issued a decree with a flick of his wrist, dismissing the man without a second glance. As he was led to the best table in the house, the one reserved for the truly powerful, Ilara felt a familiar coldness seep into her stomach. She did not know his name yet, but she knew his type. He was the apex predator in this rarefied ecosystem, and everyone else was merely prey or scenery. As she performed her duties, moving silently around the periphery of his table, a new scent began to cut through the rich tapestry of aromas in the room. It was faint at first, almost lost beneath the powerful notes of his cologne and the wine he was drinking. But her senses, honed by years of practice, locked onto it, isolating it from the background noise. It was a disturbing scent, uniquely unsettling. It held a sharp, metallic quality, like old pennies, underpinned by an acrid, almost sour note that spoke of cellular decay. It was a chemical signature she knew, with horrifying intimacy. She had smelled it in the sterile corridors of her father's care facility, a scent described in the most obscure medical textbooks as the specific biomarker for a devastating, man-made neurodegenerative syndrome. Struck by the impossible connection, she paused for a fraction of a second too long, her tray held motionless in her hand, her focus entirely consumed by the molecular ghost emanating from the man at the table. Her stillness did not go unnoticed. Marcus Thorne, in the middle of a dismissive monologue about market regulations, looked up, his cold eyes fixing on her. He saw not a person deep in concentration, but an incompetent employee, an insect that had dared to stop moving. A cruel smirk twisted his lips. "Is there something you need?" he began, his voice not loud but carrying a sharp cutting edge that sliced through the restaurant's quiet ambiance. "Or do you get paid to just stare at the customers?" He didn't wait for an answer. He turned to his associate, his voice rising just enough for the surrounding tables to hear, a calculated act of public humiliation. This is the problem with unskilled labor these days. No focus, no drive. The associate let out a nervous, sycophantic laugh. The air grew thick with a collective, unspoken discomfort. For a moment, Ilara was just a waitress, frozen in the spotlight of a powerful man's contempt. But in that moment of searing humiliation, something inside Ilara shifted. The heat of shame was instantly extinguished by a wave of ice-cold fury. Thorne's insult was not just an attack on her as a waitress, it was an attack on the daughter who had sacrificed everything. As his condescending words echoed in her ears, her mind was flooded not with embarrassment, but with a vivid, painful image. Her father, his hands trembling as he struggled to lift a glass of water, his brilliant mind trapped in a failing body. She saw the endless stacks of medical bills on her small kitchen table. She felt the phantom weight of her abandoned textbooks, the ghosts of a future that this man, this arrogant, cruel titan of industry, had stolen from her. The scent wafting from him was no longer just a medical curiosity, it was a confession. It was the living, breathing proof of his crime. The fury did not make her tremble, it solidified her, turning her spine to steel and her resolve to diamond. This is a story you won't want to miss. Before we dive into what happens next, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. We love seeing our global audience. And if you enjoy stories where justice is served, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the incredible conclusion to this confrontation. The stage is set for a revelation that will shatter this billionaire's world, and it all begins with a single, whispered sentence. Alara took a slow, deliberate breath, the air filling her lungs not with oxygen, but with purpose. She lowered her tray, her movements no longer those of a servant, but of a predator closing in on its prey. She was done being invisible. She was done being a victim. The man who had unknowingly authored her family's tragedy was about to learn that the most dangerous threats are the ones you never see coming, the ones you underestimate until it is far, far too late. His fatal error was in believing she was just a waitress. The air around their table seemed to crystallize, every molecule holding its breath. Alara Vance did not retreat. She did not flinch under the weight of his public scorn. Instead, she placed the silver tray she was holding onto a nearby service stand, the sound a soft, definitive chime in the sudden quiet. Her movements were no longer the fluid, self-effacing motions of a waitress. They were precise, deliberate, each gesture imbued with a gravity that drew the eye. The apron, a symbol of her servitude, suddenly looked like a uniform of a different kind, one of purpose. She straightened to her full height, and though she was still just a woman in a simple black dress, her posture underwent a seismic shift. It was the straightening of a spine that had been bent for too long under the weight of grief and necessity. A chilling calm settled over her features, wiping away the last vestiges of the flustered employee and replacing it with the focused intensity of a research scientist about to present a groundbreaking and devastating discovery. She took a single, measured step toward the table, a step that crossed an invisible line between her world and his. The opulent carpeting seemed to swallow the sound of her footfall, making her advance feel spectral, almost dreamlike. Marcus Thorne watched her approach, his initial arrogant smirk faltering, replaced by a flicker of confusion. He had expected tears, or perhaps a stammered apology, the typical reaction of the powerless when confronted by the powerful. He did not expect this silent, unnerving advance. The atmosphere at the table, once charged with his casual cruelty, was now thick with an entirely different kind of tension. His associate shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his sycophantic smile frozen on his face, sensing a change in the dynamics that he could not comprehend. Alara's eyes, once downcast and deferential, were now locked onto Thorne's, and they held in their depths not fear, but a cold, clear, analytical light. It was the look of a doctor observing a specimen, a look that stripped away his billion-dollar suit, his reputation, and his power, leaving only the flawed, mortal man beneath. Leaning forward, not in a posture of service but of confidentiality, she lowered her voice so that only he and his associate could hear. The words that left her lips were not loud, but they landed with the force of a physical blow, each syllable a perfectly aimed projectile designed to shatter his carefully constructed reality. "I'm not staring, Mr. Thorne," she began, her voice a low, steady whisper that cut through the ambient noise of the restaurant like a surgeon's scalpel. There was no anger in her tone, no trace of the humiliation he had just inflicted upon her. There was only a terrifying, clinical certainty. The use of his name was a small, sharp shock, a declaration that she saw him not as a generic customer, but as an individual, a subject she had already identified and analyzed. The initial part of her statement hung in the air, a puzzle he couldn't yet solve, a prelude to a revelation that was about to bring his world crashing down around him in the most public and yet intensely private way imaginable. She held his gaze for another fraction of a second, letting the weight of her calm defiance settle upon him before delivering the rest of her diagnosis. "I'm smelling," she continued, her voice unwavering, "the rare disease your doctor missed." The word, smelling, was so bizarre, so out of place in this context, that for a moment, Thorne's mind simply could not process it. It was a sentence from a madwoman, a nonsensical string of words. But the absolute confidence with which she spoke it, the utter lack of doubt in her eyes, held him paralyzed. Before he could formulate a response, before his brain could even begin to construct a wall of denial or anger, she pressed her advantage, moving from the general to the terrifyingly specific. She was no longer just a waitress. She was the ghost of his past and the prophet of his future, standing before him in a simple black dress, about to name the demon that had been quietly devouring him from the inside out. "It's called viridian neuropathy," she stated, the name of the obscure syndrome falling from her lips with the casual familiarity of a specialist. "It's a progressive, man-made neurodegenerative disorder. Very rare. Very aggressive." The blood drained from Marcus Thorne's face, leaving behind a pallor like old parchment. The heavy silver fork, halfway to his mouth, froze in mid-air, its tines trembling almost imperceptibly. His entire universe, a cosmos he had built on the foundations of control and invulnerability, had just been collapsed into a single, terrifying point. Viridian neuropathy. It was the name his private team of the world's most expensive specialists had whispered in hushed, uncertain tones in a sterile Zurich clinic only 3 months prior. A tentative diagnosis. A possibility they were still exploring with tests that cost tens of thousands of dollars. It was a secret known by only 4 other people on the planet. A secret he had guarded with the ferocity of a dragon guarding its gold. And then, Ilara delivered the final, soul-crushing blow. The one that connected his hidden illness directly to the source of his greatest sin. "The specific biomarker is a volatile organochloride, a compound called C12, she whispered, her voice laced with an icy precision that was more damning than any shout. "It has a distinct metallic scent signature, almost like old copper pennies mixed with something sour. The same signature that has permeated the soil and water around the old Chem Solutions plant in Oakhaven for the last 15 years. Every word was a hammer blow against the fortress of his denial. C12. Oakhaven. The name of the town, the name of the chemical. They were ghosts from a past he had spent a fortune to bury. He was not just sick, he was poisoned. And the waitress standing before him knew it. She knew how. She knew why. She had just drawn a perfectly straight, irrefutable line from the toxic waste he had authorized to save a few $1 million to the cellular decay that was now happening inside his own body. Thorne's carefully maintained mask of command did not just crack, it shattered into 1,000,000 pieces. For a long, silent moment, he was no longer a CEO, no longer a titan of industry. He was just a man, terrified and completely, utterly exposed. His associate stared, his mouth agape, his face a mask of horrified confusion, looking back and forth between his powerful boss, who now looked fragile and old, and the waitress who had somehow dismantled him with a few whispered sentences. The sounds of the restaurant, the distant laughter, the clinking of glasses, all seemed to fade into a dull, meaningless roar. The only thing that was real was the face of this woman, her eyes holding his, reflecting back at him the full, horrifying truth of his own mortality, and the long overdue arrival of a justice he had thought himself above. He felt a cold sweat break out on his brow, the expensive fabric of his shirt suddenly feeling clammy and tight against his skin. The paralysis lasted only a moment, but in that moment, Ilara saw everything she needed to see. She saw the flicker of raw terror, the involuntary twitch of his eyelid, the subtle tremor in the hand that still held the fork. It was all the confirmation she needed. Her hypothesis was correct. Her unique, tragic ability had not failed her. The scent was not a coincidence. It was a confession, written on a molecular level. As Thorne's shock began to curdle, transforming from fear into a deep, volcanic rage, Ilara took a half-step back, her part in this initial exchange finished. She had planted the seed of truth. Now, she would simply watch it grow in the fertile soil of his arrogance and guilt. She had not raised her voice, had not made a scene. She had delivered her verdict with the quiet, devastating efficiency of an assassin, and now the poison was beginning to do its work. Rage, pure and undiluted, was Thorne's refuge. It was the armor he put on when his control was threatened. The color rushed back to his face in a dark, blotchy tide. His eyes, which had been wide with shock, narrowed into slits of cold fury. He slammed the silver fork down onto the porcelain plate, the sharp crack echoing in the now silent space around their table. He didn't look at Alara. He couldn't. To look at her now would be to acknowledge the truth of what she had said. Instead, he turned his venom on the closest, safest target. "Manager!" he snarled, his voice a low, dangerous growl that carried an unmistakable threat. It was the roar of a wounded lion, lashing out at anything and everything in its vicinity, desperate to re-establish its dominance through sheer force of will and intimidation. The restaurant manager, a man named Julian, who prided himself on his ability to handle any situation with smooth, unflappable grace, seemed to materialize out of thin air. He had been watching from a distance, sensing the shift in the room's energy, and now he approached the table with a practiced, placating smile on his face. "Mr. Thorne, is everything all right?" he asked, his voice the epitome of professional concern, but the smile faltered as he took in the scene. Thorne's face, a mask of cold rage, the associate, pale and speechless, and Alara, standing calmly a few feet away, her expression unreadable. He had never seen Marcus Thorne look like this. He had seen him be dismissive, arrogant, and demanding, but he had never seen this raw, barely concealed fury. It was clear that some unspoken rule of this gilded sanctuary had been violated in a profound way. Thorne didn't bother with explanations. He didn't need to. In his world, his will was reason enough. He pointed a trembling, accusatory finger not at Alara, but at the manager, as if the fault lay with him for allowing such an inconvenience to exist in his presence. "I want her gone," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, a tone far more menacing than any shout. "Not just from my sight. I want her fired. Now." The command was absolute. It was not a request to be considered. It was a decree to be executed without question. The threat was unspoken but hung heavy in the air. "Deny me this, and the full weight of my influence will come crashing down on you and this entire establishment." Julian, the manager, understood this instantly. He knew that Marcus Thorne could ruin him with a single phone call. Julian's eyes darted to Alara, a flicker of confusion and perhaps even pity in his gaze. He couldn't imagine what she could have possibly done to provoke such a reaction from a man like Thorne. But it didn't matter. The calculus of the situation was brutal and simple. On one side was a billionaire patron who spent more on wine in a single night than Alara earned in 6 months. On the other was a replaceable employee. There was no choice to be made. "Of course, Mr. Thorne." "Immediately," Julian said, his voice tight. He turned to Alara, his professional demeanor now a thin shield for his own discomfort. "Alara, please, come with me." He didn't need to say more. The words, "You're fired," were already echoing in the space between them. As Alara turned to follow the manager, a quiet dignity enveloping her like a cloak, Thorne spoke one last time, his voice a venomous whisper meant only for her. He leaned forward, the predator reasserting its dominance over its prey. "Listen to me very carefully," he hissed, his eyes burning with a mixture of hatred and fear. "You will never repeat what you said in this room to anyone. If I ever hear so much as a rumor that you have, I will find you, and I will ruin you in ways you cannot possibly imagine. I will destroy your life, your family, everything you hold dear. Do you understand me?" It was not just a threat. It was a promise, delivered with the absolute certainty of a man who had destroyed people before and would not hesitate to do so again. Alara didn't respond. She simply met his gaze one last time, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes, before turning and walking away. She followed the manager through the labyrinth of tables, acutely aware of the curious stares of the other patrons. She felt like a specimen under a microscope, the subject of whispered speculation. But shame was a luxury she could no longer afford. The humiliation of being fired, of being escorted out of her job like a common criminal, was nothing compared to the cold, hard certainty that had taken root in her soul. She had found him. After all these years, after all the pain and the sacrifice, She had found the architect of her family's ruin, and he had just confirmed everything. His rage, his threats, they were not the actions of an innocent man. They were the desperate, violent thrashings of a guilty man who had just been confronted with his own ghost. The walk through the back-of-house corridors was a blur of stainless steel and hurried movement. The familiar smells of cooking food, which had once been a source of comfort and routine, now seemed foreign and distant. In the manager's cramped office, the termination was a swift, impersonal affair. Julian avoided her eyes, mumbling apologies about policy and the importance of client satisfaction. He handed her a final paycheck, the severance of her ties to this place, to her livelihood. Ilara accepted it without a word, her mind already miles away, calculating, planning, strategizing. The loss of this job was a blow, a serious, terrifying blow. The mountain of her father's medical bills loomed in her mind, larger and more menacing than ever. But fear was now secondary to a new, all-consuming emotion, purpose. She retrieved her few belongings from her locker, her hands moving with a steady, unhurried rhythm. She paused for a moment, her fingers tracing the worn edges of the photograph of her father tucked inside the locker door. It was an old picture, taken at a company picnic years before the spill. He was smiling, his arm around a much younger Ilara, his eyes bright with intelligence and kindness. This was the man whose life had been stolen. This was the man for whom she was fighting. The image did not fill her with sadness. It filled her with a righteous, incandescent anger that burned away any lingering fear or doubt. She gently placed the photograph in her bag, a sacred relic that would fuel her on the difficult journey ahead. She was no longer just a daughter trying to pay for her father's care. She was an agent of justice, the sole bearer of a truth that had the power to bring down an empire. Stepping out of the restaurant's employee entrance and into the cool night air of the city was like emerging from a tomb into a new world. The alley was grimy, a stark contrast to the opulent dining room she had just left, but for the first time in a long time, Ilara felt like she could breathe. The city lights of New York blurred around her, the sounds of traffic a distant hum. She stood there for a moment, the final paycheck clutched in her hand, the weight of her new reality settling upon her. She was unemployed. She was facing a powerful, ruthless enemy who had threatened to destroy her. She was, by any rational measure, in an impossible situation. A wave of cold, hard fear washed over her, a primal terror for her father's future, for her own survival. The sheer scale of what she was contemplating, of taking on a man like Marcus Thorne, was enough to paralyze anyone. For a few desperate moments, the despair was overwhelming. She leaned against the cold brick wall of the alley, the rough texture grounding her. The image of her father, frail and trembling in his care facility bed, flashed in her mind. How would she pay the next bill? The facility had already sent 2 letters, their polite language barely concealing the threat of discontinuing his specialized treatment. The weight of it all pressed down on her, a physical force that made it hard to draw a full breath. The temptation to run, to forget everything she had discovered, to disappear into the city's anonymity and find another menial job to keep her head above water, was immense. It would be the safe choice, the sane choice. To fight a man like Thorne was not just David versus Goliath. It was a single bacterium trying to fight a hurricane. But then another image surfaced in her mind, overriding the fear. It was the look on Marcus Thorne's face, the raw, undisguised terror, the complete and utter shock of his exposure. She had done that. She, the invisible waitress, had pierced his armor. She had found his one vulnerability. He was not a god, he was just a man. A guilty, sick, and frightened man who hid behind a wall of money and lawyers. The fear inside her began to recede, replaced by the cold, clear logic of the scientist she truly was. An equation had formed in her mind. On one side was the immense power and resources of Marcus Thorne. On the other was her unique ability, her brilliant mind, and a truth so powerful it could not be contained forever. It was not a battle she was guaranteed to win, but for the first time it felt like a battle that could be fought. The decision solidified in her heart, not as a burst of passion, but as a cool, logical conclusion. Passivity was a death sentence. It meant watching her father slowly fade away while his poisoner hosted galas and graced the covers of business magazines. It meant letting Thorne get away with not just destroying her family, but countless other families in Oakhaven who had been silenced and forgotten. The fight was not a choice, it was a moral and scientific imperative. Her hyperosmia, the strange, isolating condition that had begun as a curse, was now her greatest weapon. It was the key, the one piece of evidence that could never be shredded, deleted, or buried. It was living, breathing proof of his crime, a crime he carried with him wherever he went. A grim, determined smile touched Ilara's lips for the first time that night. He had fired her, he had threatened her, he had underestimated her, and that was going to be the last mistake he ever made. Her walk home was not a retreat, it was a march. Each step on the cracked pavement of the city sidewalk was filled with a newfound purpose. Her small, cramped apartment, which had so often felt like a prison of her circumstances, now looked like a command center, a base of operations. The stacks of medical journals and old textbooks from her PhD program, which she had kept out of a painful sense of nostalgia, were no longer relics of a lost past. They were an arsenal. She dropped her bag, pulled out her old, battered laptop, and sat down at her kitchen table, the unpaid medical bills a stark reminder of the stakes. She was no longer just thinking about defense. She was planning an attack. But she knew she couldn't do it alone. Thorne's empire was vast and protected by layers of legal and financial fortifications. She needed help. She needed an ally who understood the enemy she was facing. Her mind raced through a list of names, of old contacts from her university days, but one name kept rising to the surface, a name associated with brilliance, integrity, and a deep, personal history with Thorne Pharmaceuticals. Professor Alistair Finch. He had been her mentor, a celebrated biochemist whose career had been legendary until it was abruptly and brutally derailed. Finch had been one of the first to raise questions about the environmental impact of Thorne's aggressive expansion in the early 2000s. He had published a preliminary paper questioning the safety protocols at several of their chemical plants, including the one in Oakhaven. Thorne's response had been swift and merciless. A team of corporate lawyers had descended on the university, accusing Finch of academic fraud, fabricating data, and libeling their company. They had buried him in litigation, smeared his name in the press, and pressured the university until he was stripped of his funding and eventually pushed into a forced, early retirement. Finch had become a cautionary tale in the academic world, a brilliant mind silenced by corporate power. He lived in obscurity now, a pariah who had dared to speak truth to power and had paid the ultimate professional price. He was the perfect ally. He knew Thorne's playbook. He had the scientific background to understand the significance of Ilara's discovery. And most importantly, he had a 15-year-old reason to want justice. Finding him was not easy. He had no university email, no social media presence. He had effectively disappeared. But Ilara was a researcher at heart. She spent the next hour cross-referencing old academic directories, public records, and alumni newsletters. Finally, she found it. A landline number listed for an A. Finch in a small, sleepy town in upstate New York, a place people went to be forgotten. Her finger hovered over the numbers on her phone. A knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach. What if he refused to help? What if he thought she was crazy? He had been beaten down, disgraced. He might have no fight left in him. He might not even remember her, the promising student, from a lifetime ago. Taking a deep breath, she pushed aside her doubts and made the call. The phone rang 4 times, each ring echoing in the silent apartment, stretching her nerves taut. She was about to hang up when a voice answered, a voice that was older, raspier than she remembered, laced with a permanent weariness. "Hello," he said, the word more of a question than a greeting. "Professor Finch?" Ilara asked, her own voice sounding small, uncertain. "Professor Alistair Finch?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Who's asking?" he replied, his tone guarded, suspicious. "My name is Alara Vance. I was a student of yours. In the MD-PhD program, about 6 years ago." Another silence. Alara's heart pounded in her chest. She could almost hear him searching his memory, trying to place her name. "Vance," he finally said, a spark of recognition in his voice. "Of course. The prodigy. You were working on glial cell activation pathways. You disappeared. What happened to you?" The question was blunt, but not unkind. It was the question of a scientist seeking data. "It's a long story, Professor," Alara said, her voice growing stronger, more confident. "But it's connected to the reason I'm calling you. It's about Thorn Pharmaceuticals and the Oakhaven plant." The name Thorn hung in the air between them, a charged particle of shared history. She could feel the shift in the atmosphere over the phone line, the weariness in his voice being replaced by a sharp, sudden attention. "What about them?" he asked, his voice now low and intense. Alara took a deep breath and began to explain everything. She told him about her father, about the job at Aethelgard, about her hyperosmia. She laid out the events of the evening, not as a desperate, emotional plea, but as a scientific report, presenting the evidence calmly and logically. The specific scent signature, the name of the disease, and Thorn's violent, self-incriminating reaction. She spoke for 10 minutes straight, uninterrupted. When she finished, the silence on the other end of the line was profound. For a moment she feared he had hung up, that her story had been too fantastic, too unbelievable. But then, she heard him take a slow, shaky breath. The sound was not one of disbelief. It was the sound of a long, dormant hope stirring to life. He had spent years with his theories, his suspicions, his suppressed data, but it was all circumstantial. He had never had a smoking gun. He had never had a direct, biological link between Thorn's corporate malfeasance and a human victim. Until now. Alara wasn't just a former student with a wild story. She was the missing piece of his life's work. She was the living, breathing proof he had always lacked. C12, Finch whispered, the name of the chemical compound sounding like a prayer and a curse on his lips. "I always suspected it would be unstable, that it would have long-term neurotoxic effects that their doctored safety reports conveniently omitted. But I could never prove it." He paused, and when he spoke again, the weariness was gone, completely replaced by a fire that Alara had not heard in his voice since he had been lecturing a packed auditorium. "Miss Vance," he said, and for the first time she heard the brilliant, formidable mentor she remembered. "You are not just smelling a disease, you are smelling a crime scene. Where are you right now? We need to meet. Immediately. We have work to do." The hunt had begun. The two broken casualties of Marcus Thorne's ambition, separated by years and tragedy, had just formed an alliance, and from a small kitchen table in a rundown apartment, a war was about to be declared. The drive upstate was a journey through a different dimension, a transition from the electric, vertical ambition of Manhattan to the quiet, horizontal decay of forgotten towns. Alara drove her aging sedan through miles of whispering trees and past peeling billboards, the city's oppressive weightlifting with each passing mile, only to be replaced by the heavy anticipation of her meeting with Professor Finch. His home was exactly as she had imagined it, a small, weathered house almost swallowed by an overgrown garden, a place that seemed to be actively trying to recede from the world. When he opened the door, he looked smaller than she remembered, the firebrand intellectual of her memories buried beneath the soft gray ash of years of defeat. His eyes, however, still held a spark of the old brilliance, and as he saw her standing on his porch, that spark flickered with a cautious, almost painful hope. He ushered her inside without a word, into a space that was less a home and more an archive of a life interrupted. The interior of Alistair Finch's house was a testament to a mind that had never stopped working, even after the world had stopped listening. Every surface was covered in towering, precarious stacks of books, academic journals, and binders filled with yellowing papers. The air was thick with the scent of old paper, dust, and the faint, bitter aroma of brewed too strong tea. It was the scent of intellectual obsession and long, lonely years spent wrestling with an unsolvable problem. He led her to a small study where a path had been cleared between the paper mountains, leading to 2 chairs and a desk cluttered with research notes. He gestured for her to sit, then lowered himself into his own chair with the weary sigh of an old soldier. For a long moment, he simply studied her, his gaze intense, analytical, searching for any hint of falsehood or delusion. He was a man who had been burned before, and the scars were deep. He needed to be certain that the ghost that had appeared on his doorstep was real. Alara met his gaze without wavering, her own exhaustion and desperation, a raw, unspoken truth between them. She didn't need to embellish her story. The facts were damning enough. She recounted the events at Æthelgard again, this time with more detail, describing the precise chemical notes she had detected in Thorn's scent, the metallic tang of the C12 compound, and the sour undercurrent of advanced cellular decay. As she spoke, she saw the change happening in Finch. The weary skepticism in his eyes began to recede, replaced by a focused, predatory gleam. He leaned forward, his old hands gripping the arms of his chair, the academic in him reawakening with a jolt. He began to pepper her with questions, his voice losing its raspy weariness and gaining the sharp, incisive edge she remembered from his lectures. He asked about the compound's perceived concentration, its interaction with Thorn's cologne, the potential metabolic byproducts she might have noticed. It was not an interrogation, it was a peer review. He was testing her data, validating her methods. He rose from his chair with a sudden burst of energy that belied his age and walked to a tall, locked filing cabinet in the corner of the room, a relic from a forgotten war. He fumbled with a key for a moment before the lock clicked open. From within, he pulled out a thick, dust-covered binder labeled simply, Oakhaven. He blew a layer of dust from its cover and placed it on the desk between them with a heavy, definitive thud. The sound seemed to echo in the quiet room, a gavel striking down on 15 years of forced silence. He opened it, and the pages within were a meticulous, heartbreaking chronicle of his own destroyed investigation. There were faded chemical diagrams, copies of internal memos he had been leaked, and pages upon pages of his own handwritten notes. His elegant script detailing his suspicions about the C12 compound's instability and its potential for long-term bioaccumulation in human tissue. It was a treasure trove of righteous, buried fury. "I called it corporate-induced viridian neuropathy," he said, his finger tracing the heading on one of his old research proposals. "A name I created because the symptoms didn't match anything in the existing literature. I theorized that prolonged, low-level exposure to C12 would lead to a slow, progressive degradation of the myelin sheath, particularly in the peripheral nervous system. The initial symptoms would be subtle, easily misdiagnosed. Numbness, tremors, chronic fatigue." He looked up at Alara, his eyes burning with a vindicated fire. "But I never had definitive proof. I had environmental data. I had statistical clusters of illness in Oakhaven, but Thorn's lawyers created a firewall. They claimed it was all coincidental lifestyle-related illnesses. They buried me in litigation and character assassination. Without a human subject, a direct biological link, I had nothing." He paused, his gaze locking with hers. "Until you, Alara, are the direct biological link. You are the smoking gun." The weight of his words settled upon her, a heavy mantle of responsibility. She was not just fighting for her father anymore. She was the key to unlocking justice for an entire community, the living proof of a crime that had been systematically erased from history. A new, terrifying, and exhilarating sense of purpose flooded her veins, washing away the last remnants of her fear. She and Finch were no longer just a disgraced professor and a fired waitress. They were a team, a 2-person task force armed with a secret weapon and 15 years of suppressed evidence. Their strategy session began immediately. the dusty study transforming into a war room. They knew Thorne would have buried the evidence deep, protected by the best lawyers and cybersecurity experts money could buy. A direct legal challenge was impossible. They needed to find an unshakable piece of evidence, something so damning it could not be spun, dismissed, or buried. Their first target was the digital ghost of the Oakhaven cover-up. Finch, despite his age, was surprisingly adept at navigating the labyrinthine depths of the internet. He still had contacts, old friends in academia and digital forensics who owed him favors. For days they worked relentlessly, their lives shrinking to the four walls of the study. Ilara's scientific mind, trained in meticulous data analysis, proved invaluable. She sifted through terabytes of archived data from the period of the Thorne Pharmaceuticals' acquisition of the Chem Solutions plant. They searched for discrepancies in environmental impact reports, for deleted email chains, for any digital breadcrumb that might lead them back to the original unaltered safety protocols. The work was grueling, a search for a single needle in a universe of digital haystacks. The hours bled into one another, marked only by the rising sun and the endless brewing of coffee. The pressure on Ilara was immense. Her final paycheck was dwindling, and a new, more threatening letter had arrived from her father's care facility. It spoke of a final deadline, a date by which her account must be brought current, after which they would be forced to explore alternative care arrangements. The euphemism was a knife in her gut. It meant moving him to a state-funded facility, a place with overworked staff and inadequate resources for his complex condition. The thought of her brilliant father, a man of such dignity, wasting away in such a place was a constant, agonizing torment. Every failed search, every encrypted file they couldn't crack, felt like a personal failure, another day stolen from her father's comfort and safety. The weight of the ticking clock was a physical presence in the room, a silent accomplice to their desperate search. After a week of relentless searching, they hit a wall. Thorne's digital cleanup had been ruthlessly efficient. Every official document had been sanitized, every incriminating email chain scrubbed from the servers. The reports they could find were filled with corporate doublespeak and falsified data that was impossible to disprove without the original source material. Finch slammed his fist on the desk in frustration, the paper mountains quivering around them. "It's no good," he growled, the old weariness returning to his voice. "We're fighting ghosts, the paper trail is cold, and the digital trail has been professionally erased. We need something more. We need someone who was there. Someone from the inside who knows where the real bodies are buried." The search had to evolve. They had to move from the digital world to the human one, a far more dangerous and unpredictable terrain. Their new quest began with a single, handwritten list in one of Finch's old notebooks, the names of the key personnel at the Oakhaven plant during the Thorne takeover. Engineers, safety inspectors, administrative staff. It was a list of potential witnesses, of people who had either been complicit in the cover-up or silenced by it. The task of finding them 15 years later was monumental. Some had moved away, others had changed their names, and a few, they discovered with a chilling sense of dread, had died prematurely from cancers and neurological disorders eerily similar to those they were investigating. Each dead end was a fresh wave of despair, a reminder of how long justice had been denied. It felt like they were chasing echoes, trying to piece together a story from the scattered fragments of broken lives. Ilara took the lead in this new phase of the investigation. Her youth and unassuming appearance made her less threatening than Finch. She spent days on the road, driving through the decaying heart of the Rust Belt, following faint leads. She visited rundown towns, sat in dusty public libraries scrolling through microfiche records, and made quiet, careful inquiries in local diners and bars. She learned to listen, to pick up on the subtle hints of a community still haunted by the ghost of the chemical plant. The name Thorne was often met with a wall of silence, a flicker of fear in people's eyes. They had all been paid off, silenced by non-disclosure agreements that carried the threat of financial ruin. They had been taught that speaking the truth was a luxury they could not afford. The wall of fear Thorne had built around Oakhaven was still standing, tall and impenetrable. After weeks of fruitless searching, she found a promising lead. The name was David Chen, a former senior environmental safety inspector at the plant. According to public records, he had been fired for insubordination just 2 months after the Thorne takeover. He had fought the termination in court, lost, and then disappeared. He was a man with a reason to be angry, a man who might have a story to tell. Tracking him down was another Herculean effort. He had gone completely off the grid. But Alara was persistent. She used her research skills to trace a series of property records and forwarding addresses until she found him, living in a small, isolated cabin deep in the Allegheny Mountains, hundreds of miles from Oakhaven. He was living like a hermit, a man in self-imposed exile. Alara knew that approaching him would be dangerous. The direct confrontation might scare him off for good. She needed a way to earn his trust. She decided on a gamble. She drove to his remote cabin, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and fear. She found him outside, chopping wood, a man whose face was a roadmap of bitterness and regret. He was lean and wiry, with suspicious eyes that watched her approach as if she were a predator. He held the axe loosely in his hand, a clear warning. She didn't try to hide her purpose. She simply stood at a safe distance and began to speak, her voice calm and steady. She didn't mention Finch or lawsuits. She told him about her father. She described his symptoms, the tremor in his hands, the fog in his mind, the slow, cruel theft of his personality. David Chen listened, his posture rigid, his face an unreadable mask. But Alara saw the flicker of recognition in his eyes when she mentioned the specific neurological tics. She saw the subtle tightening of his jaw when she described the timeline of her father's decline. He had seen this before. He had seen it in his colleagues, in his neighbors, in his own family. He had warned them, he had filed the reports. He had screamed into the void, and the void had just echoed with the sound of lawyers and threats. He had tried to be a hero once, and it had cost him everything: his career, his reputation, his marriage. He had retreated from the world, convinced that the fight was unwinnable, that monsters like Marcus Thorne always won. Alara pressed on, her voice filled with a quiet, desperate conviction. "I know you were the one who wrote the original safety assessment," she said. The information, a piece of data she had unearthed from a footnote in a dismissed court filing. The one that warned about C-12's instability under high temperatures. The one that recommended a full system overhaul before increasing production. Chen's knuckles went white where he gripped the handle of the axe. She had just spoken the title of his life's greatest failure, the report that had gotten him fired, the truth he had been forced to swallow for 15 agonizing years. He had been so certain that every copy had been destroyed, that his voice had been completely and permanently erased from the official record. He stared at her for a long, silent minute, a battle raging behind his eyes. It was the battle between the deep, instinctual fear of what Thorne could still do to him and the burning, long-suppressed need for the truth to be heard. He looked at this young woman, at the raw pain and steely determination in her eyes, and he saw a reflection of the man he used to be, the man who believed that right and wrong were more than just words. He saw a chance, a terrifying, infinitesimal chance, for redemption. For his own soul, and for the souls of all the people whose lives had been destroyed by the poison that had seeped out of that plant. He had been living with the ghosts of Oakhaven for 15 years, and now one of them was standing on his doorstep, asking him to help her fight back. Slowly, deliberately, David Chen lowered the axe, leaning it against the woodpile. The gesture was a surrender, a truce. He turned and walked back toward his cabin without a word, leaving Alara standing alone in the clearing, her heart caught in her throat. She didn't know if she should follow. if she had won or lost. After a moment that stretched into an eternity, he reappeared in the doorway. He was holding something in his hand. It was an old, external hard drive, its plastic casing scuffed and worn. He walked back to her and held it out. "I was a safety inspector," he said, his voice rough with disuse, thick with an emotion that was equal parts anger and grief. "I made backups of everything. The original reports, the internal memos ordering us to ignore them, the doctored data they submitted to the EPA, everything." He pushed the hard drive into her hands. It felt impossibly heavy, the weight of 15 years of lies and corruption contained within its small, rectangular form. "He ruined my life," Chen said, his eyes finally meeting hers, and in their depths, she saw a world of pain. "Don't let him get away with it. Don't let him get away with it again." Alara clutched the hard drive to her chest, the cold plastic a talisman of hope. This was it. This was the irrefutable proof, the unshakable evidence they had been searching for. It was more than just data. It was a confession, a digital record of Thorne's crimes, preserved in amber by a man who had lost everything but his integrity. She looked at David Chen, a man broken by the system, and saw not a victim, but a hero who had been waiting 15 years for someone to finally listen. The drive back to Finch's house was a blur of adrenaline and triumph. Alara felt a sense of elation so profound it was almost painful. She had done it. She had broken through the wall of silence. She had found the key. When she burst into the study, holding the hard drive aloft like a sacred artifact, the look on Finch's face was one of pure, unadulterated awe. They plugged it into the computer, their hands trembling with anticipation, and there it was. A perfectly preserved digital copy of the entire cover-up. The original safety reports with David Chen's signature, filled with dire warnings. The email chain from Thorne's corporate office, explicitly ordering the plant manager to disregard the safety protocols to meet production quotas. And the final, damning piece of evidence, a memo signed by Marcus Thorne himself, authorizing a multi-million-dollar discretionary fund to be used for community outreach and legal settlements in Oakhaven, dated just 1 week before the chemical spill. They had him. They had his signature on a document that was a clear and premeditated conspiracy to endanger a community for profit. It was the kind of evidence that didn't just win lawsuits. It launched federal criminal investigations. It was the kind of evidence that could topple an empire. For a moment they just sat there, staring at the screen, the magnitude of what they had uncovered sinking in. The years of pain, of sacrifice, of struggle, had all led to this single triumphant moment. Alara thought of her father, and for the first time, the image in her mind was not one of suffering, but of justice. She felt the heavy cloak of grief she had worn for so long begin to lift, replaced by the light, powerful wings of impending victory. The final piece of their plan fell into place that very evening. As they were strategizing their next move, a news alert flashed across the corner of the computer screen. It was an announcement for the annual Thorne Foundation Gala, a lavish, high-profile charity event set to take place in New York City in 2 weeks. The theme of this year's gala, in a move of such breathtaking hypocrisy it was almost poetic, was advancing research in neurological disorders. Marcus Thorne himself was scheduled to give the keynote address, a speech about his newfound commitment to corporate responsibility and philanthropy. It was perfect. It was a stage he was building for himself, a platform from which he intended to broadcast his own virtue to the world. A slow, predatory smile spread across Professor Finch's face. "The arrogance of that man," he whispered, shaking his head in disbelief. "He's going to stand up in front of the whole world and pretend to be a savior, while he himself is a living embodiment of the very disease his crimes created." He looked at Alara, his eyes shining with a brilliant, strategic light. "He's not just giving us a stage, Alara, he's giving us the microphone. He's gathering all the witnesses for us. The media, his investors, his board of directors. He's building his own gallows, and inviting the public to watch. The final plan clicked into place, elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its potential impact. They would not leak the information. They would not go to a regulator. They would deliver the verdict themselves, in the most public forum imaginable, turning Thorne's greatest moment of triumph into his ultimate, inescapable downfall. The hunt was over. The stage for the final confrontation was set. The Thorne Foundation Gala was not an event, it was a coronation. Held within the grand ballroom of the city's most historic hotel, the room was a breathtaking spectacle of calculated opulence. Light, refracted through 1,000 crystal pendants on a dozen chandeliers, glittered like captured starlight, dancing across the faces of the city's elite. The air was a symphony of expensive perfumes, the rich aroma of catered delicacies, and the subtle, effervescent scent of vintage champagne. Women in gowns that cost more than a teacher's annual salary drifted through the room like exotic birds, their laughter a high, musical counterpoint to the deep, confident baritone of men who controlled the flow of global capital. Ilara Vance moved among them, not as a ghost in a uniform but as a specter of truth in a simple, elegant navy dress. She had used a significant portion of her last paycheck on it, a silent investment in the armor she would need for this final battle. Her heart was a steady, powerful drum against her ribs, a rhythm of pure, unadulterated purpose. She felt no fear, only a profound, chilling calm. The image of her father, his gentle face etched with a confusion he could not name, was the shield around her heart. Marcus Thorne stood on the brightly lit stage, a portrait of philanthropic grace. He was in his element, the master of his universe, bathed in the warm glow of the spotlight and the adulation of his peers. His voice, amplified by the state-of-the-art sound system, resonated with a practiced sincerity, each word carefully chosen by a team of public relations experts. He spoke of hope, of innovation, of a future free from the ravages of disease. He announced the Foundation's inaugural pledge of $100 million to fund research into rare neurological disorders, a statement met with a wave of thunderous, sustained applause. From her position near the back of the ballroom, Ilara watched him, her senses on high alert. Even from this distance, through the cacophony of other scents, she could detect it. The faint, unmistakable metallic signature of C12, a traitorous vapor rising from the very man who claimed to be a savior. He was a walking, talking monument to his own hypocrisy, and she was here to read the inscription aloud for the entire world to hear. He was not a philanthropist. He was a patient, desperately trying to fund a cure for a fire he himself had started. When his speech concluded and the moderator opened the floor for questions, Ilara began her slow, deliberate walk toward the microphone positioned in the center aisle. The journey felt both instantaneous and eternal. Each step was a measured beat in the funeral march of Marcus Thorne's reputation. The sea of beautifully dressed people parted before her, their curious eyes following her progress. She was not one of them. She did not carry the easy assurance of inherited wealth or the polished veneer of corporate power. There was something else about her, an intensity, a focus that was utterly out of place in this room of casual elegance. She could feel their gazes on her, questioning, dismissive. She reached the microphone, her hand steady as she wrapped her fingers around its cool metal base. She did not look at the audience. Her eyes were fixed on one man, and one man only. She waited, her patience a silent, powerful weapon, until the moderator, a well-known journalist, gestured to her. "Yes, the young woman in the navy dress," he said, his voice smooth and professional. The spotlight swung, and she was bathed in its revealing glare. "Mr. Thorne," she began, her voice perfectly calm, carrying clearly through the enormous room, devoid of any tremor or hesitation. "Ilara Vance. I am a biomedical researcher, and the daughter of a former senior chemical engineer from a small town you may remember, Oakhaven." The name dropped into the opulent ballroom like a stone into a silent pond, the ripples of its impact spreading instantly. A confused murmur rippled through the audience. On the stage, Marcus Thorne froze. The practiced, benevolent smile on his face faltered, a subtle crack in the perfect facade. His eyes narrowed, a flicker of horrified recognition dawning in their cold depths. He remembered the name of the town he had poisoned and buried, but he could not place her face. She was just another ghost from a past he had paid a fortune to erase. Ilara let the name hang in the air for a beat longer, allowing the single word to seed the room with a poison of its own: doubt. She had his complete, undivided attention. She had the attention of every journalist, every investor, and every board member in the room. The trap was set. "My question is about the specific focus of your foundation's research," she continued, her tone remaining one of polite, academic inquiry. "You've spoken eloquently about targeting rare, environmentally linked neuropathies. It's a commendable goal. So I was hoping you could comment on the data I'm about to share." With a quiet signal to Professor Finch, who was positioned at the back of the room with a laptop connected to the main projector, the massive screen behind Marcus Thorne flickered. His own smiling corporate headshot was suddenly replaced by a scanned document, its title stark and damning: Oakhaven Plant Internal Safety Assessment, C12 Compound Volatility Risks. David Chen's signature was clearly visible at the bottom. A collective gasp swept through the ballroom. Before anyone could fully process the first image, it was replaced by another. An email chain, with subject lines like "Urgent Safety Override" and "Production Quotas versus Protocol." The text, highlighted in red, showed a direct order from Thorne's corporate headquarters to ignore Chen's warnings. The camera flashes began to erupt like strobing lightning, a frantic, percussive sound that filled the stunned silence. Then came the final, soul-destroying image. A high-resolution scan of an internal financial authorization memo. It detailed the creation of a multi-million-dollar discretionary fund for legal settlements and community pacification in Oakhaven. It was a slush fund, created to buy the silence of a town before the crime had even been fully committed. And at the very bottom of the page, blown up to a size that was impossible to ignore, was a signature, an arrogant, decisive scrawl that was instantly recognizable to everyone in the room: Marcus Thorne. His own name, his own hand had just signed his own death warrant. This memo, Ilara's voice cut through the chaos, cold and precise as a surgeon's blade, was signed by you, Mr. Thorne, 1 week before the chemical spill that devastated my town and my family. This is not philanthropy. This is a cover-up. You are not funding a cure. You are attempting to buy a clear conscience. The room was in an uproar, the veneer of polite society stripped away to reveal the raw, ugly truth of what had been hidden for so long. Ilara took a final, deep breath and delivered the killing blow, her voice dropping slightly, drawing the entire room into an intimate, horrifying confidence. "But the most profound irony of all," she said, her eyes locking with Thorne's, "is that the justice you have evaded for 15 years has finally found you. Not in a courtroom, but in your own cells. The unique chemical signature of the C12 compound, the one you ordered your company to ignore, is the very same one that is now the biomarker for your own terminal illness." She paused, letting the full weight of her words land. "The metallic scent of viridian neuropathy. The disease this foundation claims to fight is the one you are currently dying from. The one you gave to my father. The one you carry with you every single day." The silence that followed was absolute. It was a vacuum. A void where all the power, all the prestige, all the wealth in the room ceased to exist. All that remained was a sick, guilty man, exposed and utterly destroyed on a stage of his own making, his carefully constructed world having been completely and irrevocably dismantled by the quiet, clear voice of a woman he had never even seen. The collapse was instantaneous and total. Marcus Thorne did not shout, did not deny. He simply stared at Ilara, his face a ghastly mask of white, his mouth opening and closing silently like a fish gasping for air. The carefully crafted image of the invincible Titan shattered, revealing the frail, terrified man beneath. He staggered backward, one hand clutching his chest as if he could physically hold his breaking heart together. The microphone slipped from his other hand, hitting the stage with a deafening boom that echoed through the ballroom like a gunshot. His legs gave way, and he crumbled to the floor, not with the dignity of a fallen king, but with the pathetic finality of a puppet whose strings had been cut. The camera flashes were now a relentless, blinding storm, capturing every detail of his utter humiliation. His associates, who moments before had been basking in his reflected glory, now backed away from him as if he were radioactive, their faces masks of horror and self-preservation. In a single televised moment, his empire of lies had turned to dust. Type justice in the comments if you got chills when Alara finally exposed the truth and brought down the man who had destroyed her family. The fall of a tyrant is a powerful moment, but what rises from the ashes is the true measure of victory. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of headlines, investigations, and the complete implosion of Thorne Pharmaceuticals. The stock plummeted into oblivion overnight. Federal investigators, armed with the irrefutable evidence from David Chen's hard drive, descended on the corporate headquarters, carting away boxes of documents. Marcus Thorne, a broken and disgraced man, was indicted on a host of charges, from corporate manslaughter to perjury and massive environmental fraud. His name became a global symbol of corporate greed and sociopathy. But Alara was far from the storm. She was in a quiet, sunlit room in the world's leading neurological care facility. Her father lay peacefully in his bed, the lines of pain on his face softened for the first time in years. The settlement from the class action lawsuit, fast-tracked in the wake of the public scandal, had ensured he would have the best care imaginable for the rest of his days. She held his hand, the tremor still there but less pronounced, and told him about her day, about the new research she was working on, and though he could not reply, she saw a flicker of the old light in his eyes. He was at peace. Justice had been done. One morning, a letter arrived for her at the facility. It was from a rival, a famously ethical biotech firm known for its groundbreaking work in rare disease diagnostics. They had followed her story, not just the dramatic takedown of Thorne, but the science behind it. They were stunned by her ability, by the brilliant, analytical mind that had weaponized a personal tragedy into a tool of perfect precision. The letter was not just a job offer, it was a plea. They offered her a position as the head of a new division, a department they wanted to build around her unique talent and her unwavering integrity. They offered her a state-of-the-art lab, a team of the world's best researchers, and a salary that would not only secure her father's future, but her own. It was a chance to reclaim the life that had been stolen from her, to step out of the shadows of her past and into the brilliant light of a future she had earned. She was no longer a victim or a waitress or an agent of vengeance. She was a scientist, finally free to fulfill her true potential. In the final scene of her old life, Alara stands in her new laboratory. The air smells of sterile alcohol and ozone, a clean slate. She is surrounded by gleaming equipment and a team of bright, eager young scientists who look to her with a respect bordering on awe. She is developing a new diagnostic technology, a machine that can analyze the volatile organic compounds in a person's breath, capable of detecting rare diseases years before the first symptoms appear. It is a machine inspired by her own strange gift, a way to share her ability with the world, to save countless families from the kind of pain she had endured. Her journey, born from a toxic spill and fueled by a father's love, had come full circle. She had faced down the monster who had created her, not by becoming a monster herself, but by using her unique insight to heal, to build, and to bring light into the darkest corners of human suffering. She had found her voice, reclaimed her power, and in doing so, had become an unstoppable force for good. If Alara Vance's incredible journey from underdog to powerhouse inspired you, Show your support by hitting that like button and sharing this story with someone who needs to see that courage can indeed change the world. And for more unforgettable stories of justice and empowerment, where the underestimated rise up to claim their rightful place, don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss a moment of righteous revenge. Your support helps us continue to tell stories that matter, stories where truth prevails and the human spirit endures against all odds. We appreciate you being a part of our community and look forward to sharing our next adventure with you. Thank you for watching.